MultimediaJay radio style.
Ladies and gentlemen, the title of this follow-up segment is More on WoW Players and Manufactured Misery. Standard more on rules apply. More on sounds like moron. So the question is always, whenever I do one of these kinds of segments, who are the morons? And I'm guessing that that should not be a hard question to answer once we're done with this discussion. As I've mentioned, and it's getting to the point where I'm having a hard time remembering what I said when because it's all blending together, WoW players have this thing for manufactured misery. They are bound and determined to see nothing right with this game ever again. Which makes me wonder how on earth Blizzard is even going to fix it. How can Blizzard fix it when there is all this garbage feedback out there coming from players who have already decided in their minds that World of Warcraft is never going to do anything right ever again, and it must always be complaining until the game shuts down. There is no such thing as World of Warcraft doing anything right, and game over. The court of public opinion has decided WoW is going to go down as the game that people complained about. No matter who wants to fix it at Blizzard or what people's attitudes are, anything of that sort that are outside of the circle of complainers. But, of course, while all of this is going on, we will see folks from time to time on the forums complaining about how Blizzard doesn't listen to the player base when so much of this trash that's going on makes the player base not worth listening to. So it's a gigantic vicious cycle where the devs and the players take turns not listening to each other and not providing proper feedback. And the player base winds up just as guilty as any Blizzy knows best stuff that Blizzard may have done over the years. And let me just remind you, when it comes to Blizzy knows best, you have to take into account the historical context as well. So Blizzy knows best with regards to nerfing healers in Cataclysm was about 10 years ago. Blizzy knows best in terms of Warlords of Draenor roughly 5 years ago. At some point, you have to say that continuing to assume that Blizzard still thinks this way based on these past events, which happened years ago, minimum, is just not fair. And it basically eliminates the chances of someone ever being happy about this game ever again. But that's the stuff that comes with the turf when you're dealing with people like this. So what inspired this discussion? Why are we talking about manufactured misery again? Well, I have here in front of me what looks like an attempt at an actual civil discussion. Hopefully it's just not another smokescreen for someone trolling me who's going to blow up in my face when I don't give them the response they're looking for, as happened last time. But because of the substantially more civil tone here, we're going to go through this essay that I received, and let me just say that I do not get involved in gigantic discussions in the comments. I'm from a generation of YouTubers where if you can make videos, you make videos, because it's easy to type a big long comment, especially if you've typed it before and you're just copy-pasting from some document you saved the last time you picked a fight on forums or something along those lines. So, and I was involved in political forums a long time ago where people did exactly that. They'd have these big discussions and you'd be like, how are they able to do anything when they're spending all this time typing stuff in response to someone that ticked them off on about some political issue? And then I noticed with the forum search at some point later on and Google searching the forums that they were copy-pasting. Whenever someone brought up the same old point, they'd respond with the same old talking point. And they had things copy-pasted in various Word documents on their computer. So they were just copy-pasting a lot of the big responses whenever the same issues came up again later. I just hope that this essay that I received is not part of that. But because the tone is at least an attempt to be a little more civil, let's take a look at this. Now keep in mind what I said earlier about manufactured misery, that WoW players won't really listen. They will just await their turn to screech back at you, never actually listen to any of your points, and just get back to the complaining, because there is no such thing as World of Warcraft ever doing anything right ever again. It must always be complained about, the game must always be terrible, And quite frankly, I don't know how any WoW developer handles their job without completely unplugging from social media to avoid all of the never-ending complaining that goes on about this game, even when Blizzard does things right. But let's take a look at this. Part of the problem is also the layers of randomness. It's one thing to farm for an item which has a random chance to drop, but when in addition to that, you also need to win a second roll to get the best version of that item, things become increasingly frustrating to players. Again, a reference to Titan forging and the dice roll thing. Dice rolls are part of RPGs, period. If you know anything at all about this genre, you'll know that the MMOs we play nowadays descended from offline RPGs, which descended from tabletop. Have you ever seen people play Dungeons and Dragons? There are 20-sided die, 6-sided die, 12-sided die. There's dice for everything in that game. And if you've ever programmed a video game before, one of the easiest ways to add an element of things not being the same is to incorporate a random number generator. But in RPGs particularly, with rolling for initiative, rolling to see if you hit, rolling to see what the damage was, etc., dice rolls have been a part of RPGs since tabletop. And even before Dungeons and Dragons, board games have dice rolls. They have dice rolls, they have wheels you spin. I mean, random chance has been part of playing games for pretty much I'm guessing as long as games have been playable. Board games, video games, or otherwise. So this sudden complaining about randomness with the Titan forging system in WoW, as far as I'm concerned, is just WoW players fishing for something to complain about. Which is why I brought up that random number stuff has always been a problem. Just listen to any strategy guide from the earlier or golden years of the game, as some people might call it, where they complain about something on a boss's loot table that never ever drops, never ever ever ever. Or for a more contemporary example, go to one of those Asmongold highlight channels and see if you can find the clip where he's going nuts about the chromatic carapace and how many times he's run UBRS and he still can't get that thing to drop. At some point, complaining about random number generators in RPGs throws your credibility completely out the window. We continue. At least in traditional WoW, once the item drops, that's it, you are sorted. In turn, having certain drops always contain the same fixed stats also means a more level playing field between players at similar gear levels, compared to the frustration of having the same item after killing the same boss, but the other guy simply getting lucky on Titanforge. Yeah, that's a talking point, and that's why I responded to it. But the thing is, there's no leg to stand on when it comes to complaining about dice rolls in RPGs. What this current narrative would suggest regarding Titan forging is that Titan forging is too powerful. That it's a deal breaker if you don't get the Titan forged version of an item. However, if Blizzard were to tune this down, how would this not turn into an argument about Titan forging is nearly useless? Why does Blizzard even have it? Why is it even a thing? I don't think Blizzard can win in any of this. I don't think Blizzard can ever make their own player base happy on this matter. And that if they want to have this kind of random upgrades to quest items and other drops and stuff, they should just have it at the current strength they have it at right now, because no amount of modifying this system is going to make this screaming and hollering go away. And again, we look at the whole best in slot thing and how that basically takes all of the strategy out of the game. You go to your third-party website, you get your min-max build, you get your min-max gear list, and then you mindlessly grind until you have it. That is inherently problematic in an RPG where you're basically playing a character and living another life in another world, so to speak. And again, metagaming, another point that I brought up, where you cannot have a good experience with a video game because you are constantly being biased away from actually playing the darn thing by outside information. This first half paragraph ignores point after point after point that I made in the initial discussion of all of this in order to continue complaining. And this is what I've come to expect from WoW players these days, and even a couple of years ago. And this is why this game goes nowhere. Blizzard doesn't listen to the players. How can they? If this is the kind of stuff that goes on, how are they ever going to get any decent feedback on how to improve this game when there's this much stuff floating around and people don't actually listen. They simply wait for their turn to fire back in an argument because everything is always some life or death Armageddon showdown. I got news for you. It's an MMO. It's a video game. It isn't. We continue. At least in traditional WoW, no, I've already read that part. So it's the first paragraph that ignores point after point after point that I made last time. See what I mean? Forget anything good or any attempts to say that BFA does anything right. It must never be the case. We must always shout them down and keep complaining. Okay, good luck having Blizzard ever fix this game then. But you know what? There's people out there that don't want WoW to be fixed. They want Classic to take WoW's current position, and that's not going to happen either. Look at how Blizzard's marketing it. It's an archival product. Come experience Azeroth the way that it was. There you go. The only road forward is for Blizzard to improve the current game. And yet there's people that are bound and determined to never see anything right about it whatsoever. Blizzard, nothing Blizzard does is ever going to matter. They must always complain about it until the game shuts down. And by the way, takes Classic with it if that ever happens. But that's another discussion entirely. We continue. While the current gaming industry praises randomness, it is easily the most frustrating part of any game to have randomness block your progress, so adding additional layers to it creates more feel-bads than feel-goods. Scientifically, you need approximately 8 good experiences to equal 1 bad experience. Cite that, please. Even a supposedly good experience of winning a loot roll, personal or otherwise, is tarnished when you lose the second roll, which is Titan Forged. And again, this is why the best in slot thing and the whole metagaming thing, which is a plague on these RPGs as far as I'm concerned. Because the development team goes to all the trouble to create this wonderful world, and then nobody cares about it. It's always about min-maxing and stuff like that. This is the sort of stuff that should stay in the MOBAs, but good luck in that respect. Bonus points for Blizzard being stupid enough to pursue the MOBAs at one point with the game mechanics, the ability pruning, and how the combat system was redone so that esports look prettier when streamed on Twitch, when WoW Arena championships and whatnot are going on. But that's another discussion entirely. But again, current gaming industry praises randomness. That is nothing new. That is 100% anachronism and looking at everything through, well, actually, I don't even think it's an anachronism. We're not talking about changing things in the past here. But it is absolutely not true that randomness is this huge obsession that came out of nowhere. Dice rolls have been parts of games forever. Seriously. You have to go back to checkers and chess to see a lack of dice being rolled or something like that. I mean, seriously, enough of this whole trying to fabricate something to complain about by any means necessary. And again, the talking point about Titan forging, which I am very familiar with, which is why I responded to it. But my response gets nothing. Nobody cares. And sadly, and it just blah, 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 and then fire back first chance you get. Don't actually listen to the points or in any way, shape, or form accept them. And this is why the dialogue on this game goes nowhere, and this is why the game itself goes nowhere, because this is what feedback in World of Warcraft land looks like. People wondering why they're talking past each other because they're just shouting at each other or complaining about each other, not actually doing anything constructive. While you are right that an element of randomness was always in the game, it was to a way lesser extent. No. Meaning the overall experience had fewer risks of giving players a bad experience caused by randomness. No. Personal loot rolled out because of problems with dice rolls blocking people's progression. Smaller raids because of dice rolls blocking people's progression. If a boss drops 2 tier tokens, you're less likely to tick off a wide swath of the raid when it's only 10 or 25 people instead of 40 people. And don't forget, anybody who's ever spent any significant time in the so-called good years of WoW running the same dungeon over and over again because a certain thing would never ever drop. That is equally frustrating, as opposed to, I previously didn't have the item, now I do. And oh, maybe there's a couple item level points that separate me from somebody else that just got a bonus. But I still have the item, as opposed to not having it. As opposed to all those people who ground the heck out of Heroic Mechanar or Shadow Labyrinth back in Burning Crusade. Or some other dungeon that had some awesome thing in the loot table that took a bazillion runs to get. I dare say that if that sort of stuff were released today, people would be whining that it was a form of time gating. But I brought that up in general chat before and gotten shouted down for that as well. You don't know what time gating is. I don't. Play Classic, where you spend 2/3 of the leveling experience on foot. And you tell me that that isn't a world that's loaded up with stuff just for stuff's sake, without much thought put into the content, when quest after quest after quest is kill 10 boars, collect 10 apples, and there isn't even phasing or anything, so Classic can't do anything fancy to feel like anything you're doing is actually making a difference in the world. Oh, you downed this terrible boss that's been terrorizing the town. They'll respawn 5 minutes later for the next people. Yeah, early MMOs, baby. Gotta love it. In addition to that, the video needs a lot less emphasis, well, the podcast, you mean, on the content in the game and more on how that content is handled. Oh, really? The content doesn't matter, but how it's handled? So, in Warlords of Draenor, there could have been a better way for Blizzard to handle Apex's dailies, which were largely considered filler material during that year-long drought before Legion launched? Or how about any of the year-long content droughts when Legion launched? Was it ever an issue with how the content was handled as opposed to the content itself? No. People would say, oh, just roll alts. No, that's Band-Aid stuff. If you don't want to roll alts, what are you going to do for these months and months and sometimes over a year of no content in this game that has existed at various points in its history? Time and again, the content is the problem. What Blizzard is releasing as content is the problem. I even have people trolling me in the comments about content that is released that's the problem. Or, oh, have fun letting Blizzard spoon feed you what they call content. Not so much how it is handled. Let's continue. The one huge common consensus is that Classic offers a better experience than retail because it offers a social aspect. Oh, you mean the forced socialization? The stuff that Blizzard had to address when nobody was left in the zones to group up for elite quests when you were behind the 8-ball and everybody else on the server was further ahead than you were. A problem which, by the way, is going to be exacerbated in Classic because there is no things like cross-realm zones or anything of that sort. Not loot, not story, but the actual gameplay. What gameplay? It's action bar combat. Been a thing for a long time. People these days, in some circles, consider it to be dated. Even my own discussion on mandatory targeting from 2015, nearly 5 years ago, back then I considered it dated to have, for example, a character with a sword, but when you push the button, the character would never swing that sword, even if it was a cleave attack, unless you targeted something first. How much sense does that make? BFA is more of a single-player game, which features handy-dandy bots for running dungeons and raids, as opposed to the living, breathing community of Classic with constant social interactions, which create small stories and permanent friendships and feelings of accomplishment. Where are the bots? What bots for running dungeons? I'd love to actually run a dungeon with AI. It would probably be better than most of the groups that I get. Take last night for an example. I tried running a BFA leveling dungeon. Freehold had a quest in there. Went in to heal it because the DPS queue would take forever. Got this complete idiot of a tank who stood in the green stuff and was really squishy because they didn't know what active mitigation was, and they kept dying over and over again. Huge repair bill, as the group kept wiping and wiping until we finally cleared the content. But at least they were idiots and not overtly malicious to the point where, oh, kick the healer. That's something I used to see back in the day, which is, I could say, improved. But still, when nobody wants to actually do things right, then I would much rather have something like Final Fantasy XIV's trust system, because, again, WoW players are part of WoW's problems, and forced socialization is an MMO failure. I have made friends in this game before that I've run lots of dungeons and even PvP'd and did arenas with. But until I meet more of those people, because a lot of those people got bored with the game and stopped playing several expansions ago, what I'm finding over and over again is that games with toxic player bases like World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy XIV, I end up playing those like single-player games anyways. I'm only interested in the story. So right now with BFA, I'm just going through the story with Kultiris, and I've got a Horde character who's going to go through the story with Zandalar. Maybe see the conclusion of those stories by just doing an LFR at some point, not really playing on any high difficulty levels. But as it stands, I am routinely disgusted by what I see players doing. The game itself is fine. The story with what's going on in Kultiris and the drama between the Proudmoors and the Ashvanes, fun stuff. Blizzard does a really good job with art. They do a really good job with presentation, and nowadays they have way better storytelling in the leveling zones than they used to have back in the earlier parts of the game. But I have such terrible luck with WoW players in general compared to other games that I actually want to just play this game alone, unless I happen to meet some people that are actually want to play this game properly instead of just grinding through mindlessly complaining about the tank being too slow or something along those lines. Again, like I've been saying and has been persistently getting ignored, both through people responding just to holler out the same old talking points and through the crap views that happen on any upload or podcast that I make that doesn't just fall in line and be negative towards BFA. WoW players are part of WoW's problems, and forced socialization is an MMO failure. There's nothing wrong with socialization and making friends, and a lot of times you meet people who are good at running stuff, and you basically, get to have a great experience in the team content because of that. But when you have to put up with somebody just to see how a story ends, and you have to deal with somebody who doesn't really give a darn, or they're not going to play right, or they're going to blame you for everything that goes wrong, that's what ruins the experience, and that is exactly the experience I have with BFA. So as it stands with BFA, as well as Shadowbringers, I just want to play those games to get through the story and then shut it all down and go back to ESO, because the WoW community has given me no real reasons to stay involved in this game for very long after finishing those stories. Why? So I can have unnecessary headaches because of all the people out there that are treating this game like crap and just looking for things to complain about and looking for people to complain about, to blame shift away everything they're doing wrong and pin it on others? I don't need that garbage. So no, the constant social interactions and forced social interactions are not a good thing, as is the case in real life. You're not forced to interact with everybody you come across in the offline world, and with some people that are out there that you may not approve of, you may be happy you don't have to deal with them. The rules of socialization don't change just because we're playing a video game here, especially an MMO, which built itself up on lots of players populating the game world. And that is without getting into the problems relating to content difficulty outside of Mythic Raids, which I talked about, another point ignored. I may be biased because I'm leveling as a tank, and I've been leveling as tanks ever since Cataclysm when the world difficulty was jumped up to get away from the Lich King meta. And now, of course, there was more of that in Legion, which people complained about, but I wouldn't mind a little bit more difficulty in the outside world, but I think it might be there and I just don't know it because I'm playing the game as a character who can tank. We continue. How convenience has killed a lot of the experience? That's debatable. Simple games that are easy to pick up and play can do well. Just look at Rocket League, which is a far more contemporary example than the Atari games that it reminds me of. How the combat system feels like a lifeless spam fest where your abilities have no identity compared to vanilla, where every single ability has a purpose and offers a slower experience than having to constantly spam glowing buttons like a deranged whack-a-mole. That's not true either. There have been specs in the earlier parts of the game, like Feral Druids, for example, that were called carpal tunnel specs because you had so much to keep track of and things along those lines. If anything, and Blizzard has already been rethinking ability pruning, that maybe they shouldn't have gone so far as they did in Legion and going into the original launch of BFA. Again, more things that Blizzard has done that are just going to get ignored in favor of more complaining. But you want to talk about spamming glowing buttons like a deranged whack-a-mole, Lich King Ret Paladins are a wonderful example of that. There was no identity. There's nothing that really made it so you wanted to do Crusader Strike or Judgment or Divine Storm in any particular order. Just whatever was up, you hit that. So, and Lich King considered a good expansion. And yet, Ret Paladins and Blood Death Knights and Death Knights across the board, I also dealt with Frost back then, were spam fests as well. There was really no setup move to a finisher or anything of that sort like what rogues have. But I play a lot of different classes these days, and a lot of times I will, before I really get into what the roles are, look at what all the heals do and what all the damaging spells do and figure out how I want to deploy them, so to speak. Like the Lava Burst mechanic with Shamans, where you Flame Shock, and then you use Lava Burst afterwards. But the thing is, I'm so used to this sort of stuff by now that it's tempting to think that it's dull, boring combat simply because I've got it down ice cold, as opposed to somebody who's brand new to the game that doesn't know how any of this works yet and is playing a shaman just spamming lightning bolt everywhere they go. But does that lightning bolt spammer get kicked from groups instead of being told how things work? Of course, there is an adventurer's guide off to the side, if it ever pops up. I mean, does anybody tell anybody about the rotation guides in the adventurer's guide? You know, people complain about, oh, people buy a boost. At least when you buy a boost, the NPCs walk you through a standard rotation. But somebody starting out from level 1 and they're getting these abilities for the first time, how are they going to figure this out until they see some kind of strategy video on YouTube or something? Is there any place for somebody brand new to the game in this game anymore? Or has WoW players gotten to the point where they expect people to basically go from zero to hero? And lastly, on the topic of convenience killing the experience, it depends on what defines convenience and what defines the experience, because the experience of feeling like things take way longer than they should to do things like try out a new build or something like that is not something that I fondly remember. And quite frankly, the MMO world outside of World of Warcraft has been moving in this direction to the point where WoW is very much behind the 8 ball. Take, for example, ESO, with its very shallow gear curves, although you can go in to get better versions of the gear at higher difficulty levels. If you want to try out a new build, you don't have to spend weeks just getting a piece of armor or whatever. You basically can go pick dungeons, craft, get the gear pretty quickly, and then upgrade through trade skills to see what it's like without too much of an investment. So if it's not something you like, you just move on to the next thing. And the same thing, too, with going back if you want to do it again later, get your gear back. It's not that difficult. As opposed to, I remember grinding like crazy for pieces of arena gear as a paladin in Burning Crusade, and just feeling like I'm doing the same stuff over and over again to the point where I no longer care about the content just because I want to go from point A to point B. How is that experience versus convenience? What I see with that is other MMOs learning from what World of Warcraft has done wrong over the years and still offering a good experience despite the shallow gear curves. There's just more armor sets that make you, maybe I want to try that, so I'm going to go run this dungeon for a couple of days to get all the pieces, and then I'll have everything and I'll just upgrade it to Epic and Legendary and see how that works in terms of builds, and just deconstruct it if I don't like it and then get a bunch of crafting materials from it. We continue. It isn't that Classic is old, it's that Classic is an MMO that rewards skill and doesn't offer easy ways out, thus causing investment in it. No, that's not true at all. Classic is an MMO from the earlier days when Blizzard didn't have a lot of the technologies they have today. So there are numerous examples of situations where time investment is what's rewarded, not necessarily any skill. You look at raiding, for example. The fights are pretty much down right now. You can watch videos on YouTube to figure out how to do the fights before you even set foot in the dungeon. Raiding in many ways, especially with only one difficulty level, boils down to the lowest common denominator being improved to the point where you can clear the content. You have someone who's keyboard turning and constantly getting blown up by AoE. You have somebody who doesn't know what heals to use when. It's more a matter of getting past all the finger pointing when the raid wipes and finding out who the lowest common denominator is and improving that and seeing if that's enough to down the boss. That's what raiding in the earlier years of WoW is all about. That's not skill. That's simply managing people. And that's, if there's any skill component, it's only getting just enough skill to C- your way through the encounter. There really isn't much of a reward for being better at the encounter when it comes to those kinds of raids. BFA is not an MMO. It's a single-player game with competent bot allies for the most part. What bot allies? If I can run a dungeon with bots, I will be glad to do so, to get away, even if it's slower, to get away from most of the dreck that runs the dungeon finder these days. So it's just, if I could meet good people, I'd love to meet them and run dungeons with them, but it's just never-ending frustration with this game. I have substantially better luck with ESO and even Guild Wars 2 these days when it comes to meeting folks that I want to run stuff with. Of course, in ESO, there's a crossover between dungeons and the outdoor world with all the outdoor events and the world bosses. So it's possible to run into somebody who you actually like by seeing them fight an outdoor mob, and then you ask him to go run a dungeon with you or something like that. WoW's pretty weak in that department, with the outdoor world being like running around on a stage at some play or something, where instead of a believable world, everything feels like props or something for some stage play. But the whole thing with BFA not being an MMO, no, it just needs a little tuning up here. And I don't get the whole bot allies thing. Where on earth, where does that come from? Because I'd love to play more content with bots, actually. I have such little faith in WoW players that most of the times when I run a dungeon just to see the end of the story, I would much rather run that with AI. So that way I don't have a bunch of people that are mindlessly grinding for something that don't care about the story, that just want to blitz their way through the dungeon as quickly as possible, like it's football or something. So yeah. The other area where we probably agree on, though, is the catch-up mechanics as well. Constant ways to get past the content if you can't be bothered to play properly. Well, the thing is, with the content nerfs and the catch-up mechanics, I've talked about that too. Has that been ignored as well? Is that yet another point that I've made in previous podcasts that is being completely ignored just to continue arguing? This is where I think the game started to decline, was the Trial of the Crusader patch, when catch-up mechanics were introduced that made it so only the current content matters, and there's no real reason to go back to, say, Naxxramas and Ulduar when you can run like the 5-mans to get your catch-up gear, or even Icecrown Citadel. And this is in Lich King, considered a good expansion by people. But this is something that even Asmongold and I agree on, is that when Blizzard stopped making it so the whole world matters and turned it into only the current content set matters, they nerfed the game. And nowadays, competing games like Guild Wars 2 and ESO have reacted to this by finding ways for the game world to get bigger as you progress instead of smaller. And they're being rewarded for it by being viable competition versus World of Warcraft, while World of Warcraft feels like the dinosaur of MMOs these days. And so that's really the whole thing. Player freedom. There's some pretty nice zone stories in the game that I haven't gotten to, and I may have a hard time completing with other characters if I don't freeze my level, so that way the challenge stays there in terms of killing the mobs in certain parts of the game. That's what Blizzard needs to fix in the next expansion in order to get with the times. They have to make it so that if you want to, for example, immerse yourself in the story of Ulduar, despite it being an old Lich King raid from a long time ago, that you can do that without face-rolling everything in sight. But of course, have the option too, if you want to just go get some transmogs and you don't really care about the story, to go in and stomp everything with one hit. And that's why I talk about Time Walker mode, and why I keep pushing this idea over and over again, even though it's not the same 6 or 7 points the big World of Warcraft talking heads keep talking about on their huge YouTube channel, so it gets crap views and goes nowhere. Boo! Let's finish this up, shall we? Low skill requirement and constant ways to get past it if you can't be, yeah, we talked about that. Classic barrages you with small rewards and feel-good moments. Like what? Even if just surviving pulling 2 mobs by accident. No, that's increased world difficulty. That's more risk-reward. And that's the world making more sense. That's something I gotta actually make a video about whenever I get back to gaming videos. Because I noticed it when I was going through Elwyn Forest in low-level characters in Classic versus Modern. The bandits in low-level Elwyn Forest operate as a team when you attack them. And in BFA, they're kind of placed, kind of like someone double-clicked to place mobs. So it looks more like something made in a game maker program in the modern game as opposed to what existed back in Classic. The fun part is, and I got my first experience of this with the AI in Island Expeditions last night, which is supposed to simulate PvP players. I think Blizzard has the tools to fix their world difficulty problems. The question is, when are they actually going to do that? Because they've been working on the AI for NPCs in those PvPvE type scenarios, which, by the way, exist in other games as well, where you are playing against your enemy faction, but it's AI instead of people. If Blizzard develops this further, they're going to have a pretty interesting experience on their hands. It might actually make people think about what it is that they're doing. The question is whether or not they follow through on it. BFA fails to reward the player in the same way and creates those feel-goods on a daily basis. So that's the thing. There are elements of Classic, though, that you could say are a form of time gating when you look at it through today's lens, like running around the world for 2/3 of the experience, the lack of graveyards, the lack of flight points, and the overall feeling that, much like in Warlords of Draenor, Classic is designed to keep you in the game artificially as long as humanly possible. But this gets us back to the fanboyism and the stuff we were talking about at the very beginning of this discussion over a half hour ago. Specifically, toxic WoW players who love their manufactured misery. They absolutely will refuse to acknowledge when modern WoW ever does anything right, and I'll bet that continues even if the game is improved. Despite the fact that there are some of those big talking heads out there that are hoping that modern WoW improves because they realize that that's the only future this game has. Modifying an archival product like Classic after the fact isn't going to help anybody in that case, and Blizzard is advertising Classic as a historical experience. Come see Azeroth the way that it was. So that is off the table as far as improvements to the game are concerned. And on the flip side, even with people going from modern to Classic, there are people that refuse to see anything wrong with what it is that they're playing simply because they got away from modern WoW. It happens in Classic, it happens in ESO, it happens in Final Fantasy XIV, and it's ridiculous because once you know what to look for, you can spot this stuff and be like, oh look, yet another person refusing to believe there's anything wrong with the game they came to from WoW, or refusing to believe that the WoW they came from can ever get anything right. It just gets old, and it's all part of the manufactured misery, and it helps no one in the long run. Because in order for this game to get better, there needs to be a way for Blizzard to receive proper feedback to improve the game. And between all of the channels that are available, the crap views that I get on YouTube, tweets that go nowhere, the official forums where if you're not toxic, you get shouted down or blown off, so your thread sinks to the bottom very, very quickly. Between all of the ways that Blizzard could receive communications that might actually help the game get better, I have little faith that any of them can possibly be productive. We'll have to see what happens at BlizzCon. That may be the only chance that we get to see if Blizzard has any chance of improving this game whatsoever. But if it doesn't work out, I'm an ESO guy. I'll just go back to ESO. And I've got a couple thousand crowns in my account that have been accruing while I've been away playing this game as well. Kind of interesting how ESO Plus gives you a compelling reason to keep the subscription going even if you're not playing the game, as opposed to what WoW's doing these days. So how's that for a follow-up? Definitely something to digest, at the very least. Maybe I should put in a clickable program guide or something if I really want to hammer this out. Till next time, this is MultimediaJay signing off. Thanks for stopping by.